Yeah. I'm actually audible visible.
Yes to both.
Yeah. POIs preferably from closing opposition. I'll at least take a POI or a clarification. Please put POI on chat. I'll definitely look at the chat. Please don't verbalize POIs, please. Yeah. Mm. All right. These reforms from RBI are a crucial step in terms of taking India from a service sector third world country to a country that is going to compete with China on the global level in terms of capturing the opportunity or capitalizing the gap that is left by decoupling and increasing Cold War between China and the United States. There are three ways in which Indian economy is going to benefit, which we're going to talk about. The first thing is a lot of NRI generated businesses or startups come back to India or don't move out of India in the first place. The reason why this is true is something we'll explain in the argument in itself. But the reason why this is important is because we are going to prove a large proportion of such businesses that are opened in India that have huge profit potential or growth potential in India, or the businesses that are opened by these NRIs. The second thing we're going to prove is in terms of how India has a huge demand for debt, both in private debt markets and for state bonds, and how you uniquely bridge that gap because of these easing of regulations. And finally, on how does a stronger currency lead for India to be a major export-based economy in terms of capitalizing on these very gaps that I talked about. The first thing is just on how do you bring back businesses or don't let NRA businesses move out in the first place because of this easing of regulation, which is the delta that exists in terms of reducing barriers for these NRIs to set up businesses. A lot of businesses don't move out of India or set up in India because the problem that existed before these reforms are threefold. And I'm going to tell you after every mechanism or every bit of problem as to how this reform solves this problem. Firstly, a weaker rupee meant that you had to create far more profits or far more revenue as a business that is set up in India in order to compete with international players in the global market. The reason why this is true is because when you are earning profits or revenue in a weaker currency, and when other players that are set up in Singapore or London or US or earning profits or revenue in stronger currencies, the arbitrage that is growing between a dollar and a rupee or between a Singaporean dollar and a rupee also compounds to the loss that you're taking in terms of your decreasing internal rate of return versus the competitors' return that they are generating. This is exactly why most investors go towards the companies that are set up in Singapore or London than the companies that are set up in India. At a point at which, like, even if investors invest into Indian businesses that are owned by NRIs, they force these businesses or they direct these businesses to move out of India. This is exactly why you see things like Flipkart moving out of India. You see things like many startups moving out of India or at least setting the headquarters out of India. The problem with this is that a lot of tax money that India could have capitalized on and like could have spent on people is being missed on as an opportunity cost. The way this solves the problem is because you uniquely create a strong currency when you have when you create three mechanisms. The first mechanism is when you lend to countries that are in need, which are neighboring countries or which are countries that you probably have a trade deal with, and you decrease the barrier for you to do so through the second point of this policy that is present in the info slide. That means there is more demand for your currency, that is rupee, to begin with. The reason why this is true is because when you lend to a country, the preconditions that any country posits is that you trade with those countries in rupees or you trade with other countries at least on a local level in rupees, which is the leverage at a point at which most countries don't take collaterals in the first place. This is exactly why, due to increased demand, you have a stronger currency. The second reason due to which this is true, due to which you have a stronger currency, is because when you like allow foreign entities to get to keep what is it called? I'm so sorry. To keep SVRAs in Indian banks, the access to Indian rupee by these people is much easier because of lesser bureaucracy in the first place. What this then means is that there is lesser hoops or lesser transactional costs that are entailed. Like PayPal does not exist for large scale transactions, or any other such alternatives does not exist for large scale transactions, and that is exactly why setting up of these SVRAs is something that's crucial in terms of willingness of even global north countries to use your currency in transactions or in trade in the first place, even when you incentivize them to trade agreements and so on and so forth. When this becomes the tipping point, the demand for your currency increases as a second mechanism, even if you don't buy the first mechanism, and that is exactly why you have a stronger currency, and that is exactly why you change this. Secondly, NRIs are the people within India, provided that India is a country with 1.5 billion population, and a lot of people 80% of India doesn't even earn 20,000 rupees per month, means that these people have unique access to capital can exclusively be trickled down, that can't come from any other alternative. What this then means is that when you restrict these people, or when you have increasing barriers towards these people to set up their shops in India, the incentive margin gets decreased, at a point at which other countries are also competing with you for them to set up their businesses as headquarters because of the same tax benefits. All of this, is when all of this is changed when you go ahead and decrease the regulations that you have towards the Indian firms that exist for you to go ahead and have this in the first place. Thirdly, the ease of acquiring foreign clients is something that is more for NRI businesses that are set up in India now, because of the same decreased bureaucratic cost in terms of transactions that I talked about, because of you setting up or you decreasing regulations on SVBR to begin with. All of this is why a lot of startups or businesses don't move out of India, which clearly has tax benefits that I explained. Secondly, on corporate and government bonds. Before I go on POI, closing.
So just to clarify your policy, do you stand for a significant reduction in, let's say, the checks and balances about the government giving out loans?
Significant decrease in checks and balances means you have a stronger currency, and that is where all these tipping point comes along. We are perfectly fine with it. If you want anything to argue in inverse, good luck with that. Secondly, on corporate and gov bonds, there's a huge requirement for capital infusion in India, both in terms of state treasury and private debt markets, because of three reasons. Firstly, India is a fast growing economy, which means the government is spending a lot on infrastructure, welfare, and investing into people in itself in terms of education and stuff like that. What this then means is that India needs a lot of money for this growing population with 1.5 billion people. Secondly, a growing economy means that a lot of companies or businesses coming up, and businesses, if they are not getting investments, they at least need debt, which is a lower risk asset, lower risk instrument. What this then means is that when in corporates or businesses need debt, they issue corporate bonds, and that is exactly why this fulfills into businesses getting money. The reason why you uniquely get money from our side of the house is because local investors naturally don't are not enough for you to invest in these businesses or invest in these government and corporate bonds, at a point which you already have you already have a lot of middle class people that are investing in stock markets, which is still not enough. This is exactly why this extra money that is going to come suffices the demand at which it is growing. On simple terms, this simply means the money right now is enough, but at the rate at which India is growing, you need more rate of inflow of currency or more rate of inflow of capital, which this uniquely bridges in terms of allowing banks to invest in corporate and government bonds. Incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for that fine speech. Inviting Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Hi, just checking if I'm audible and visible.
Yep, go ahead.
All right, thanks. POI's chat, happy to take one from closing. Whew, goddamn. Yep. The two things I would like to clarify in the setup before moving to two arguments in the speech is the first is in terms of what we support on our side when it comes to using the rupee, and secondly on international trade. Firstly, on the rupee. Obviously, I think we still believe that India is an independently attractive nation to invest in for foreign direct investment, not necessarily because you give them the rupee. Reasons for this because there's a growing middle class and young population. There's a greater consumer base, so therefore you want to also create producer goods there, consumer goods there for you to directly sell to the people on the ground as well. So there are natural incentives for companies who want to invest in India either way on both sides of the house, or needs to prove why there's an additional result of this. But what we explain is that when companies choose to invest within the domestic Indian economy, the way in which they have rupees to invest in the local economy, such as like paying their workers, etc., is by going straight to the central bank. Like the central bank probably has stringent restrictions and limits the amount of currency that you're still able to gain. Like India historically has notoriously been strict and stringent in terms of how much money they give specifically. I think we just support a central bank that has greater control, but also influence over where the money flows on their side, on our side of the house. The second is in terms of international trade, because I would believe that, like, independent of using the rupee, I would note that India right now can still support a basket of currencies that we see right now. So obviously we're willing to defend the world in which India uses the USD when it comes to partners that use the USD. They use the euro and renminbi when it comes to China and other European states specifically. I just want to note that there are natural market systems in place when it comes to using global currencies to make sure that currency stability is still in place, such as how many other, such as how the American Central Bank also now has to consider and factor into its trade partners when it comes to creating interest rate policies, which means that naturally the market itself regulates in a way that makes sure that the currency itself does not fluctuate at a greater pace. But I would note specifically in this round that the main difference is that these baskets of currencies are just far more stable relative to the rupee that's being used within side of Gov's house. Two arguments in the speech. First is just why the internationalization of rupee will likely fail and why that leads to worse outcomes. The second is why it harms the power of the Indian central bank and why is it something that we should oppose. The first is on why the internationalization of the rupee will likely fail and lead to worse outcomes. I just want to note 3 reasons as to why the rupee, even if you use it and you allow for individuals to own more rupees, it might likely not be receptive. The first is just to explain most of India's trade partners and the relationships they have with them. India has a really dynamic relationship between countries like the US and China, and it's historically hitched itself between both hegemons. What it means is that its major partners such as the US likely will not adopt the rupee insofar as the US has a vested interest to continue the use of the USD, whereas China right now is trending towards using the renminbi or also using other alternative systems of the USD rather than letting countries themselves use their own currency as a means of trade. So China likely will use its own currency, either use the euro or just will not use the rupee. But secondly, even if you do have ownership over the rupee, we will explain most of the owners are quite small actors, like countries like Russia or countries like small neighboring states like Bhutan or Bangladesh that historically traded with India using rupee. We will know that likely these are countries who still do the same. The third is just to explain why a lot of times the reason why individuals will still not use the rupee in international trade is precisely because there's large amounts of speculation in Indian economy. Indian elections have been swayed by large amounts of youth unemployment. People question whether or not India is still a viable state of place, whether or not India's local domestic politics is stable enough. So even if people still want to invest in a local Indian economy because there's a large population, the problem is that they don't believe in the strength of the Indian government to be able to ensure that regulations are in place to make sure that the rupee itself is a stable one. So they will naturally default to still using other international currency. I'll take you later. But why is this specifically a harm? We will know that independent of whether or not this is widely adopted, in order for India to use the internationalization of the rupee, it has to increase the money supply of the rupee. So it means selling off its foreign reserve in exchange for foreign rupees to come back into the local economy, to just print more money to begin with so that you have more money to supply to these individuals. Why is it a bad thing? The first is just I would explain that this creates greater amounts of inflationary pressure onto Indian economy. The reason why you should believe that this is important is the first is just that Indian elections have been I don't know, I think this is true because I read about this, but maybe not. It's just the fact that inflation has always been a pressing issue, specifically because of the population. Most of the individuals buy consumer goods from foreign lands, such as farmers, because their income is used to buying foreign imports rather than India's own domestic goods. But secondly, it's also the fact that inflation itself is quite bad for India's growing economy, because even if India is export based right now, the point is that it wants to create and expand its industry. So it means that it imports large amounts of natural resources, imports large amounts of goods in order to build the factories and hire experts to begin with. So greater levels of inflation, because there's more money in circulation for the rupee, leads to that pressure and therefore also hurts the Indian economy insofar as your purchases become more expensive. The second one is explain why it becomes lax. So CEO explains in the POI that now you're going to have to reduce the regulations, and OG says that it's a good thing. I'm saying fuck no. The reason why this is true is precisely because in order for you to attract more companies to use the rupee, you have to reduce the regulations, reducing the interest rates, giving loans with for individuals with lower credit scores, or allow them to set up bank accounts easier. We explain why this is oftentimes a bad thing. The first is to explain there's an opportunity cost that exists. So when you give out money to and this assumes that the money supply is constant, this now means that more money is going towards businesses and foreign companies rather than traditional microfinancing institutions that India and South Asia has historically relied on. So it means that you have less money to loan out to individuals from impoverished backgrounds for consumer goods, for education. But secondly, even if you do not believe this, we just say that it creates a large amount of risk, because now the hands of the rupee is now in the hands of foreign investors specifically, we say that this is really a bad thing because when one specific bank fails and one company decides to pull out, it creates a chain reaction of capital flight. The reason why India wants to protect its currency so much is precisely because it knows and recognizes the fact that its economy is quite volatile. So any company that chooses to pull out starts a chain reaction whereby everyone wants to pull out their rupee, creates greater amounts of like capital flight, and therefore oftentimes devastates the economy. I take a point from Gov right now if there's any.
This debate is simply about decreasing the regulations on lending to neighboring countries, not to corporations or other people with lower credit scores. And also, Modi has been in power for 10 years. Why do people not have trust on Indian government when he's pro-liberalization?
Yeah, correct. So what I'm saying is that the first is that, yeah, you're increasing. I don't really get what the first part of the POI is, but the second part is just that, like, yeah, even if Modi is in power for 10 years, like, we've seen how there's growing opposition, but also at the same time, there are lots of structural issues that India has not been able to solve. Precisely because of this, that even if people want to invest in India, people don't want to use the Indian currency. You need to prove why there's a tipping point for people to want to use this. Even if there's a tipping point, our second part of the argument just explains why we want more money in the hands of foreign investors is a bad thing specifically, precisely because they're able to conduct things like capital flight outcomes at the opportunity cost. You have to engage in an argument. Finally, why does it harm the power of the Indian central bank? The first I just want to explain is that right now, India values its sovereignty. Like, people care largely about inflation. People care about the policies that the central bank does in terms of its livelihoods, precisely because India right now requires large amounts of cash on hand because people want to spend money on these things, because the farmers need like immediate cash flow. So it matters a lot to them. But specifically, we explain that when you internationalize the currency, that's when you have to increase the amount of factors that you have in terms of considering whether or not you want to raise interest or increase money supply in terms of monetary policy. So the central bank can no longer just consider factors such as how the Indian economy is doing or inflationary pressures domestically, but have to compete against how stable it wants its currency to be. So it's likely going to not increase or decrease its interest rate as much. We say this is a bad thing because it's now less receptive to the plight of individuals. Oftentimes, businesses require lower or higher interest rates to that flow in order to make sure that they're able to save or spend more money, like have more money in the domestic market. We need larger fluctuations precisely because this is what enables India to control itself and control its economy to a greater extent. We're so proud to oppose.
Thank you for that fine speech. Inviting Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Give me a second and I'll start. Here I come closing, if not opening. Cool. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem with OO is that they debate a different motion. They do not take into consideration what these policies particularly look like and debate like a vague notion of India just trying to make their currency like a global hegemonic currency like the dollar is. The motion simply is about easing regulations and making it easier to access rupees. Because if they want to say that, hey, the US wants to do trade in US dollars, that's perfectly fine. But the problem is India does not generate money in US dollars. India needs to procure US dollars from the US or from somebody. And to do that, they need to be able to convince that other person to take the rupee from them and then give them dollars because their local tax revenue is generated in rupees. In which case, if the rupee is hard to access, if the rupee is volatile, if the reference rates are not known very easily, and if the rupee can and if the price that you expect the rupee to be in is probably something that is different from the price that the rupee ends up being when you finally carry out your transactions, means that it is harder for India to access dollars because people don't trust the rupee or like people don't give you as many dollars as they could have because they have to deal with all this hassle. At the point at which you make the rupee easier for people to access, it means that more people buy from India because now they're more willing to purchase rupees to then pay Indian businesses with those same rupees because you cannot pay Indian businesses with dollars. They have no use for the dollars. They'll also have to exchange it for rupees at some point, in which case like it becomes the same thing. In that case, Indian businesses are able to sell more to foreign clients, able to do better exports, etc. But secondly, like at the point at which you allow these people to particularly have things like bank accounts, etc., where they can hold like larger sort of things like larger reserves of rupees, etc., it means that things are less volatile. That is to say, at the point at which I can buy up, let's say, 100 rupees right now, and I am negotiating a deal that I have to pay for in rupees, and I have a certain amount of money, it probably means that I do not need to repurchase rupees later, in which case the rupee might have gone down in value, might have gone up in value. It might upset my calculations that way. In which case, if I have a lot of rupees in my SVRA bank account, it is far easier for me to manage the risk associated with the rupee. Similarly, if there are lesser transactional costs, if there are lesser bureaucratic hassles, it makes it far easier for me to go ahead and purchase the rupee because I do not have to pay these overhead charges. And at the point at which you do large transactions as a corporation, these overhead charges add up. Thirdly, at the point at which you probably do not want, you probably have to spend a lot of effort in hedging the rupee. It probably means that you choose other alternatives that you think are more stable. All of this means that you probably want the rupee to be more easily accessible for foreign businesses to access India. In which case, it becomes very, very important for India to be able to capitalize on the gap that China has left at the point at which they've been tariffed by the US. India has also been tariffed by the US, but to a far lesser extent, in which case there's a significant leeway or significant competitive advantage that India has right now on which it can capitalize. Why then does India have a lot of manufacturing capacity? It is fairly simple in terms of one, India has a young population, a far bigger workforce than China does at the point at which our population is significantly younger. Two, because of policies of Trump, etc., that makes it very hard to immigrate. India has historically low brain drain, where the brightest of the brightest are now contemplating staying in India because they do not know whether their future in a foreign country will be certain, which means that you retain this particular kind of talent that can run these kinds of manufacturing industries, etc. The Indian government is pushing towards these sorts of manufacturing at the point at which they're launching schemes like Atmanirbhar Bharat, which is already pushing for India to be self-sufficient. Fourthly, India is largely non-committal in its relationship, as O acknowledges, which means that it is unaffected by geopolitics and some fairly stable in terms of its supply chains, which means that India has a lot of capacity to do manufacturing, in which case, if India is able to capitalize on this gap left by China, and if India is eventually able to develop into a good manufacturing economy with the help of these sorts of manufacturing clients, which generates profits that they can reinvest, or with the help of companies that move their investments from China to India and then help India out with their expertise or their technology, etc., it means that India has a good long-term prospect of becoming a manufacturing economy. One of the biggest hassles in doing this is the ability to access currency. Because it's not just about inefficiency or the cost of doing business, it's also simply about the ability to do business. It's about time. You probably do not have the ability to negotiate with the central bank or take money in small chunks at the point at which you need to be able to make payments for major dealings. You want to have a significant amount of cash flow, which means you are not able to do these kinds of things. Why then does OVO not work? Number one, the idea simply is that you do not need to print a lot of this money. That's a small part of this motion. A lot of this can be accomplished simply by making the regulations easier or simply by making the reference rates more transparent at the point at which people feel more comfortable buying Indian currency because they know that the price wouldn't fluctuate or the price wouldn't turn out to be different from what they expected it to be, in which case their calculations then get upset. At which point you probably do not need to print as much money to be able to go ahead and do this. But secondly, we just do not understand the trade-off with things like funding, microfinance, etc. If anything, as Vishwa explains to you, there's far more accessibility of debt at the point at which companies can now invest the surplus money within these accounts in things like bonds, etc. It means the government has access to more money with which it can do the kind of things that O wants to talk about. The government isn't giving money out of its pocket to corporations or to foreign corporations. They are simply making it easier for them to access this currency. And in turn, these corporations are then using this currency to invest in the government. As Vishwa explains to you, this is something that is incredibly good and there's incredible demand for debt. Probably this also incentivizes corporations because their money does not need to lie idle. We're going to move on POI.
In your POI to O earlier, you concede that this debate is mostly about regions, but now you talk about big actors like the US massively being incentivized by these reforms. Which is it and why?
I mean, I'm not sure why it can't be both, but anyway. At that point, you probably have far more investment. You have far more investment in terms of businesses, startups, etc. As Vishwa explains to you, in which case there's a lot more NRI investment. There's a lot more capital that comes into India, which then trickles down to populations in terms of generating more employment, generating more tax revenue for the government, which the government can do for welfare, and doing things like giving out money in terms of bonds, etc., which the government can then use for things like welfare. Similarly, in terms of doing trade with other countries in the neighboring region, India probably has the ability to replace, let's say, global hegemons in terms of doing trade, simply because the competitive disadvantage that India has is in terms of its currency being hard to access, in which case, if you make your currency more accessible, to like these other countries. You're probably able to have stronger trade relations with them. You have better trade, you have more export, you have more investment. All of this is very, very good for India with 1.5 billion people. Pretty large scale of impact. Very proud to propose.
Thank you for that fine speech. Inviting the yellow. Here.
Sorry about that. Checking I'm audible and visible.
Yep.
All right. Let's jump into this. This debate, as any finance debate, is deeply confusing. What we prove at opening opposition is the process of liberalization is bad. And this should be weighed quite highly in the round because OG's claims are quite nebulous. They're like, this may lead to a stronger currency, whatever the hell that means. And that leads to more investment, but people already want to invest in India. Like, there's a lot of speculation in that case. And I think you should just weigh it quite low at the end of the day. And maybe Udai can explain things and make this debate comprehensible to me. But I'm just going to explain things in a very simple way to explain why making, firstly, a stronger currency is inherently bad for OG's own claims, but then secondly, explaining why they don't get like the increase in investment and they don't make a change there. Let's just talk about why this process in of itself is bad. And the benefit, like, then this is starting, which is OG want to try win this debate by suggesting a stronger currency is good for India. But like a stronger currency means that there's more. So, and I guess it's like what I want to do with this debate is that this financial debate, especially from OG, is incredibly confusing. So I just want to paint a very clear picture so that you're more likely to kind of in your ballot cast it to OO. And the problem is when there is more demand, like when you, so what does it mean to have a stronger currency as OG claimed? A stronger currency was where there's more demand to hold the Indian rupee. For example, things like loaning as claimed by opening government. The problem that exists with this is that it makes it far harder to export current goods and develop the export economy that opening government want to give. And the intuition I want to start here is, why do you think China deliberately keeps the yuan quite weak? And it's to make it easier to export. So why does this make it harder to export currency? A stronger currency means that people want to hold rupees. The reason for this is that they can make more interest from this currency. For example, if more countries like Nepal are borrowing from the Indian bank and borrowing it in rupees, then you are more likely to make more money from those rupees because there is like in the sense of like people are likely to borrow those rupees from you into the future. But there's also more demand because those rupees are likely to make you money, for example, as countries have to repay back on those bonds. The problem that then exists is that people want to hold onto rupees and they don't then want to buy Indian exports. Why does this make it harder to export? Because, and I just want to start with framing here, which is India's greatest export in the status quo is oil and raw materials, as long as like jewelry and telecommunication. Opening government want to also export more manufacturing goods. The problem to create demand is that you need to want people to then, you want people to give up rupees so that they can, give up rupees to the people so that they then, like, they can buy the telephone. For example, if you want to buy a telephone from India, you want to give up that rupee to the Indian, like the telephone manufacturer, so that you can then get a telephone out of that. The problem then is if people have a demand to hold rupees as opening government claim, they don't want to give up their rupee because what opening government do, for example, is when they loan more to Nepal, is they create an opportunity cost, which is that rupee could also be building or like could be accruing interest, for example, with countries and their other loans. And the problem then is that these manufacturing prices go up, which is people are like, well, I could certainly get some money from these loans, while this kind of telephone and other stuff might not provide as much value. And the outcome that is a result of this is when you have a stronger currency as opening government claim, people don't want to give up their rupees to Indian businesses, and that makes prices go up for these goods. And that just means that India gets outcompeted by nations like Bangladesh, China, and Vietnam. Because these come, and that this is just like nukes OG's entire benefit. Because they do not get, for example, like the companies earn less money. They don't get investment in manufacturing. They get job loss. They get less local investment. And this is horrible. Like, it just undercuts their case. So it flipped their case. And it reduces exports. The claim that exists at the crux of their case, like even if you believe their case is good, they suggest that you should change the demand for the currency. The problem is they don't explain why people choose India over other current options. For example, the IMF is super trusted trustworthy. They want to get their money back. They have years of success. And this is something that people and nations do opt into. Where they don't trust the IMF, they go to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, which has proven that it doesn't want to intervene with these nations, that it has a large amount of capital. So where you have to take a loan, I'm unclear why you're taking it over India, over other nations. But finally, the problem is that there's a first mover disadvantage, which is if you move away from the global trading currency, which is the USD, there's no guarantee that people will accept Indian rupees, which is everyone needs to accept Indian rupees if you want that to be a currency which people buy. But no one, like if no one else is buying it, then no one else opts into it. Like people just stick with the USD. So there's no point moving away, and it's very hard to convince other nations to move away. So the weighing is the scale of change that opening get. Like that mechanism is severely weakened. At best, they get small nations, but they don't create change. The final problem that exists with the policy that opening government get is that they have to significantly introduce, like they have to increase the amount of rupees that exist in the economy, which is to believe that benefit that you get more manufacturing money, you have to believe that there's more rupees that these current people can hold on to. The way that you can create more rupees is that the central bank has to print them out. And this is horrible because that just creates inflation, which is if there are more rupees being printed out, that means people will have more access to rupees. So that people believe that they're less valuable, which is if I can get rupees easier than before, then I don't, for example, I think they have less value. So goods become, I ask for more goods for the rupees for my goods. And that just means that people's quality of life is significantly worse. And India has one of the largest populations of the, one of the, I guess, most economically disparate populations, where this increase in inflation does significantly hurt their day-to-day lives. So on scale, this inflation, even if it's only a small amount, significantly reduces their ability to look after themselves. I'll take a POI from CG if they have one.
Surely this is deflationary because the imports are going to be cheaper.
No. I guess it's just like the problem is that it's not deflationary because it's where India has a lot of its production in its local economy. For example, local agricultural things like wheat, and that then becomes I think that what leads to the inflation. Maybe it's deflationary, and I don't understand, and then you can win us out on that. But my intuition doesn't work that way. And the final problem is that you also the final problem that exists with this is that the rupee exits the control of the central bank, which is opening government now moves a lot of the rupees to other nations, and the problem is this reduces the central bank's ability to control things like inflation and unemployment because it can't control the local supply of rupees as much. And this is horrible because then it means that you can't do things, for example, like increase interest rates to decrease the kind of inflation that occurs. And then I guess those harms occur otherwise because then you have to also capture international rupee supply. So that's why I think we weigh our opening government. Like these are certain harms. Let's then just deal with the problem. Like opening government's main benefit is you get more investment into India. But the problem with this claim is like they explain why India is super lucrative to invest in the moment. Like it has large populations that are being quite skilled. So I'm just unclear why there isn't already a maximal desire to invest in India and how this meaningfully tips and changes this at the end of the day. But the problem is I think you create moral contagion. Just if you're investing large amounts from banks, like I think this encourages banks to give large amounts of loans. I think these bank companies fail. They have less money to give to local Indians as well who can't increase their quality of life to use these loans for education and their houses. That seems pretty bad. On intuition, go with opening up.
Thank you for that fine speech. That concludes top half. With that, inviting member of government to commence back half. Here.
Closing Government will provide 3 contributions to the debate. Firstly, we'll explain why this policy will succeed, which is a gap in opening government that opening opposition contests. Secondly, we'll explain why a stronger rupee is in fact good, providing much better impacting than opening government. And finally, we'll explain the real benefits of foreign investment for India. Let's start with the first claim on why this plan will succeed, because OO hinges their case on the idea that it doesn't, so if we're able to prove it succeeds, that means we must beat opening opposition, and opening government relies on the plan succeeding for its benefits, so this will necessarily take us over them. Opening opposition give us 3 reasons why people won't want to buy rupees even after these reforms. Firstly, that the US and China would prefer to trade in their own currencies. Secondly, that the rupee is volatile and therefore unattractive. And thirdly, that markets are underregulated. I want to first note on that mechanism about US and China that this makes the mistake of assuming that countries engage in trade when actually it is individuals and firms that do. So while the US government or the Chinese government might have a particular preference, that does not speak to the preferences of individual businesses that might have, for example, very large amounts of currency exposure to the Indian market, and therefore it might make sense for them to want to trade in those particular currencies. Secondly, on the claim that the rupee is volatile and markets are underregulated, I would note that these claims are entirely asserted by opening opposition, and I'm not particularly sure that it is true that the markets are underregulated or that the rupee is particularly volatile. But thirdly, even if those claims are true, it is not clear that the existence of some reasons why India might be an unattractive market mean that there will not be any investment in India. And this is a point that opening opposition concedes at the beginning of the Leader of Opposition speech, where they list 5 different reasons why people might want to invest in India. So obviously there's a trade-off between some reasons to invest and some reasons not to invest. The claim at closing government is that this moves us closer to India being more attractive, and on the margins, more people will invest. It seems very unlikely that this would have no effect, which is the claim that opening opposition wants you to believe. But fourthly, we'd point out that there are an obvious set of stakeholders for whom this would be a tipping point. For example, firms that do a lot of trade with India might be able to reduce their currency risk by engaging only in trade in the rupee, rather than having to use, for example, the US dollar, which is useful in general because it allows you to trade with many different countries. But if your trade is only with India, then you don't really need the utility of the US dollar. You'd rather hedge against the currency risk of trade with India by using the rupee. Secondly, foreign investors who want to invest in India would prefer to be able to buy rupees at the time of their choosing rather than having to do so later. But thirdly, non-resident Indians, as opening government identifies, often have reasons to want to have money within the country, and this makes it easier for them to do so. It means that they're likely to invest more money. But fifthly, we would note that obviously just reducing frictions in accessing the rupee, in setting up bank accounts, and investing in that country means that on the margins it is more likely that that happens because India becomes more competitive relative to the many other countries that exist as investment options. What are the implications of this? As I point out, this defeats opening opposition's case and takes us over opening government, but I also want to address the harms that opening opposition attempts to tie to this claim. They say you will need to lower regulation in order to attract investors. Firstly, it is unclear why lowering regulation is bad. India is one of the most over-regulated countries in the world. It is very hard to do business. It's unclear that it would be bad to make it easier to do so. But secondly, it seems like it would be more likely that opposition bench would need to engage in deregulation and perhaps harmful forms of deregulation. Because we're doing one thing that makes it easier to invest in India. They're not engaging in that policy. They would need to compensate by making themselves more attractive in other, perhaps more pernicious ways. Secondly, they say this risks capital flight, but considering India doesn't have capital controls and capital is free to leave if it wants at the moment, it's unclear why this policy that makes India a more attractive investment destination would see a net outflow of capital and not a net inflow of capital. Thirdly, they say central banks lose control because now you need to care about the stability of your currency and not just, for example, how, the dynamics of the Indian market. But this is untrue. You need to care a lot about the stability of the rupee at the moment because companies and individuals in India are massively exposed to currency risk if the rupee, for example, massively increases or depreciates in value. So you already need to care about the stability of the rupee. You actually reduce people's leverage, risk and exposure to currency risk. So if anything, the opposite is true. Second extension then, why is a stronger rupee good? Opening government has some mechanisms for why you get a stronger rupee that I think are good. We're going to provide what I think is a much simpler and stronger one, which is just that for all the reasons I explained in the first extension, there is demand for the rupee, the supply is constant, therefore the rupee goes up in value and becomes stronger. Why does this matter? Firstly, it rebuts opening opposition's claim that this would be inflationary, because the opposite is true. When your currency is stronger, imports are cheaper, your money is worth more, therefore you are richer, not poorer, the value of your money is greater, not lesser. Secondly, it is useful to be able to import more because you are able to buy more foreign goods, which India is notably very reliant on. And importantly, the poorest people within India are the people who need to import goods, not the business owners trying to export goods. So it is crucially important that, for example, medicine or consumer basic goods that people rely on are cheaper for the poorest people in India rather than, say, Adani is better able to engage in exports. But thirdly, because of the nature of trade that occurs at the moment, this is good even for your exports. Before I explain why, I will take opening opposition.
Yeah, so your analysis on why more investment increases is reliant on existing partnerships that India has, which concedes the fact that it's a marginal increase in investment. But what we point out in OO is that the control that the Indian people have over their own currency decreases and comes to the expense of foreign companies which own larger amounts. Why is the marginal benefit more important than the harms that Indian people have expense with a less
It's not at all contingent on existing partnerships. People who are considering prospective partnerships would obviously also be influenced by this as well. Secondly, considering the impacts of compound growth and the growth of the Indian economy, the number of such prospective partnerships is quite large. But thirdly, even if this is marginal, we would say that for a very poor country, marginal differences matter. And fourthly, there is no trade-off in terms of control of the rupee. The argument you make is just a factual as to how central banks operate, and I've already refuted it. So that POI is ineffective. Why is it that trade is better on our side? There is normally a trade-off between importing and exporting. If your currency is stronger, that's good for imports. If your currency is weaker, that's good for exports. But notably, we operate in a context of protectionism, where the US uses tariffs to prevent people from having a trade, a trade deficit, preventing the US from having a trade deficit with countries like India. India is currently subject to large numbers of tariffs because it exports far more to the US than it purchases back, which means it doesn't gain the benefit of having a cheap currency. The US gains a benefit in terms of the taxes they extract via tariffs. If we have a stronger currency, we import more from the US, and we can do so more cheaply, but it also means that we reduce the tariffs that the US imposes on us because the trade deficit is lower, which means we also get to have our cake and eat it too on this particular issue. So that just gets better on our side.
Thank you for that fine speech. Inviting member of opposition. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
CEO would bring forth two broad lines of
Two questions. First, will this work? Second, if it works, would it be desirable? On the first, this is clearly the most important question in the debate for three reasons. Firstly, as Udai explains, this is the question which kills opening opposition, because it is the question which explains why their quibbles with whether this will produce a stronger currency are unlikely to manifest. Second, for the reason that opening government are contingent on this. And I think there are two senses in which opening government are contingent on this. The first is that identified by Udai, which is that opening government rely on the currency strengthening in order to achieve their benefits. They're actually very light on their mechanisms there. They just get strong on the impacts down the line. But secondly, and more importantly, this argument scales up every other argument in the debate. Because if you believe that there are many other people that are interested in investing in India, if you believe that our options and our choices are very large and diverse, that explains why we can adopt this policy in the most sensible way possible, which explains why some of the quibbles that CEO have, things like, oh, really speculative sus countries will invest in you, do not manifest, because those circumstances are ones we can rule out, ones we can exclude when we have more options. So this claim is incredibly important. We make a series of responses to OO and a series of further explanations of why this is unlikely to change, none of which receive direct response. What I will instead respond to is the claim of closing opposition, which says, by line of extension, there is less accountability in how you choose to give out loans, which means you do a bunch of sus speculative things. There are three responses to this claim. The first is that it is untrue that in the global market, people trust based on the amount of democracy that your country has. And in fact, I would say the more democratic a country is, the less trust international investors have in it. Because that is when you have more uncertainty. That is when you don't know the direction of one election or another. That is when you are very speculative about the way the country's policy will be written into the future. In fact, companies love autocracies. They love countries that are democratically backslid. That's why Hungary's economy is gangbusters, why Turkey's economy is gangbusters, why India's economy is gangbusters, because they can achieve the benefit, the fact that everyone knows Modi will continue to be in power for a significant period of time. So in fact, there's more investment because of this argument, not less. Second, speculative companies are fine. It is not a big deal to have companies invest in you. They're speculative. For the reason that those companies aggregate each other out. So maybe one of these companies is really sus and it might go bust or it might pull out, but the other companies are not sus for the same reasons. They're not problematic for the same reasons. So if one of them goes down, the others remain in effect, which explains why on aggregate, we still end up being fine. Thirdly, there is likely to be more corruption under their side, which breaks the deadlock in this clash, because they say, well, India's government is equally corrupt and equally likely to engage in bad and shady practices. It just gets manifested worse under your side. I will explain that it in fact is less corrupt under our side for two reasons. The first is that there's far less regulatory capture under side government, because the reason that regulatory capture exists in India is that there are very few, very large, powerful companies, like for instance, Adani, which has enormous influence over the Indian government. The reason those companies can manipulate the government is because they have so much leverage. They are all the ones with the financing to do things like run media, run infrastructure. Their cooperation is essential. We are able to break that because when you introduce more international businesses, those businesses do not have the same incentives. They do not want to maintain corrupt practices. They do not want the government to continue to be corrupt because that creates investment uncertainty. So we counterbalance the power of Adani under our side. But second and crucially, companies become less corrupt under our side. And that is because foreigners own their debt. So perhaps it is fine if the Indian government doesn't care that Adani is super corrupt. But when the Hindenburg Group publishes research that shows that Adani is engaging in corruption, foreign debt investors who own debt of Adani do care because those are the ones who are worried about whether they will be sued by their home governments for engaging in corrupt practices, which explains why those countries are likely to be less corrupt, which flips closing opposition. Opening opposition, go.
Your benefit is that you get more imports, but these imports outcompete local businesses, which means you don't get infrastructure building or jobs to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty.
It is in fact great for to compete with local businesses. And the reason is that over-regulation and over-protectionism created by the lobby of Adani and Indian farmers who are incredibly powerful has meant that these businesses are too coddly, they're too protected, which is why India produces far less rice on average than all of its neighbors because it doesn't adopt things like modern fertilizer or the new rice grains that came out of the Philippines in the 80s because it's so lazy, because there's so much domestic protection for these farmers. We think it's fantastic if these people get competed against. They won't be out-competed against because they've got so many favorable treatments from the government. They will always stay in business, but maybe they'll be forced to finally get off their asses and actually produce grain, which is good for the world. It is good for the amount of food that ordinary Indians can afford to eat. Obviously, it is desirable to do that. Second argument, is it good to have this currency? The first thing to say is the opening opposition claim, which is that in order to entice people in, you must lower regulation, which is good. The opening government response is merely to say, well, regulation deters investment. And the reason this is an insufficient response is no explanation is provided on whether it's likelier that regulation is good stuff like microfinancing or good monetary policy, which OO say it is, or bad stuff, which OG says is like shit that, red tapes down currencies and stops currency companies from being able to work. We will explain two things. First thing is that on average, the regulation and monetary policy of India is bad, so getting rid of it would be good. That is for three reasons. Firstly, there is a history of political capture by large businesses, as I've explained. Secondly, there's a history of political capture by large lobby groups like farmers who have enormous amounts of power within India. Thirdly, things like microfinancing are not profitable in India for the reason that there is plenty of capital in the economy. The problem is the amount of capital that can be allocated to individual people, which is why this is unlike Bangladesh, where the Grameen Bank could do microfinancing very well, which explains why the average bit of regulation is written by a corrupt government that has been bought out by Adani and the farmers in order to coddle those farmers up. It is not likely to be the kinds of regulation OO describes. And I note that monetary policy is equally bad for the reason that the Indian government has a lot of control over the monetary policy of the RBI through the MPC committee, of whom 3 of the 5 members are appointed by the government, which explains why the monetary policy is likely to be undesirable. Our second response to OO is that they say that you have to lower regulation is good. We are the side that explains why there's less corruption and less amount of state capture for the reasons I've given in this speech and we give by way of extension, which explains why the OG claim, which is that there are more businesses under our side, is augmented by a far more important claim, which is that there are better businesses under our side because those businesses are not weighed down by corruption. Finally, what do we introduce by way of our first extension? We introduce a very simple but very devastating claim that a stronger rupee is amazing. It leads to less deflation. It leads to deflation. It leads to more foreign goods being imported into the country. It leads to less tariffs. And I want to rebut this explicitly against the CO claim, which is that you can do development into the long run. And this is a claim that is evil. First, because the utility of exports into this country is so minimal, because the exports provided are from the best companies, the companies that have the most capacity to access international finance. Those companies do not in any meaningful sense support ordinary Indians. In fact, they profit off of their labor and their harms. And the second reason you should not care about this argument is that it is so unbelievably speculative. There's so much that has to go right for these exports to end up achieving growth in India to take it to where CO wants it to be. And for far too long, ordinary people in India have been told you will pay more money for imports that are necessary for your daily life. You'll pay more money for food, more money for fertilizer, more money for water, more money for electrics, because one day that will lead to development, and they have never had development yet, and it will not come. You ought not subjugate them under that basis. Very, very proud to go.
Thank you for that fine speech. In writing